Welcome to the Bonafide Leaders Podcast with your host, Tim G. Williams. Let's get to it. Hello, Tim G. Williams, and welcome back to the Bonafide Leaders Podcast. Today, this is episode 3, and we are going to talk about managing and leading change. So,
All right, let's do it. Let's talk about change.
all right. So, change is happening quickly. That's a kind of a norm, a cliche even in business. It is changing fast. Technology, expectations of a business, relationships between employees and employers, lots going on there. So I want to hear from you just a little bit about defining change. What do you mean by that? What is change? How do you define that? And maybe provide an example so listeners are kind of tracking with the rest of what we talk about change. I want them to understand kind of where we're going with this.
Yeah. All right. Well, change is defined differently for everybody, but the way that I would think about change is a shift. Something that was before is no longer. So in a business, simple context is you're one day working, and this happened to me literally within my first 4 months of employment. I actually had interviewed with a person, and that person ended up becoming my boss, and just expected to have this nice, long-lasting relationship. Then within 4 months, that person got promoted to a new job. And so now I had a new supervisor. So that's a real simple example of change. Organizational shift. Let's say you're in sales, and at the moment you got responsibility for 5 key accounts that you're calling on. But there's a shift in that you want to move from, we'll call them HICS, or huge important customers, or big important customers. Maybe now you're moving to focusing on, let's say, 20 more mid-size accounts that you as a salesperson are calling on. That's an example of a shift. In your personal life, it can be as simple as garbage delivery day, which for us happens to be on a Wednesday. City decides to move that to a Tuesday. Or it can be as big as we're pregnant and the baby's coming, right? So this has changed the way I like to think of it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Okay. That's helpful. I have a 1-year-old, so the we're pregnant is like, it triggers me. In a good way. I love my family. Okay. So you mentioned, there are 3 different kinds of components of change, the ways to understand it, break it down, analyze it. And so you describe change as there is a size component. So the size of change matters, kind of what you described. There's big kind of change or small kind of change. Mm-hmm. That's important. There's the agent of change. Yep. So what is driving this change? Who started it? That kind of thing. Yep. And then there's the desire of change. And I want to dig in a lot more to that. I've got so many questions. Give us kind of lay of the land of the size, agent, and desire of change in the way that you think about kind of analyzing it or breaking it down.
Yeah, so let's take an example of one that I can relate to very much, and hopefully the listeners can too. In a business context, businesses are continuously evaluating divesting a part of the business, or acquiring a part of the business, or acquiring technology, or divesting of factories, let's say, for example, that are no longer adding value in the way that you want them to add value to your company. So let's say that one day you're making an acquisition, so you're seeking to grow. Well, when you talk about size, how big is that company? If you are a $20 billion company and you're acquiring let's just say a set of engineers, an engineering team, maybe they're software engineers of 20. Well, if you're a $20 billion company, that's not necessarily a huge impact to the company. Size is relatively small from a company perspective. However, if you're that product line or that business unit that's inheriting those individuals, and maybe you're only double the size of that engineering team, well, now your engineering team just got huge. And so that's a big size change. Also think about it in terms of desire. So were you seeking this acquisition? Did you want to add this technology capability to your wheelhouse? In some cases, you would say, yes, we needed that. We wanted that. It augments our business. In other cases, maybe you didn't ask for it, but maybe, so you're not the agent of change, I can think of another situation, keeping with the acquisition situation, where I was a part of a business unit. We were a growing business unit, and we had evaluated our competitors in the marketplace, and we actually wanted to acquire another company. And we floated up the chain, went through all the processes and did all the analysis. And I was cheaply behind doing that analysis to see if this would be accretive, that it would add value to our business. And so I was the agent of change. My general manager, we were desiring that change. But in some cases, you're not necessarily wanting. And so for me, now if you think about another piece of it, you got the size, you got the desirability, you got the agent. The other is the direct impact or the personal involvement of a change. And so let's say in the case of that small acquisition that we just talked about, the 20-person engineering team, let's say you're asked to be the integration leader. Well, it's one thing to go drive and manage and lead the integration versus, let's say, it's someone who reports to the person who's the integration manager. The direct impact and personal involvement is very different. Or let's say you're in another product line or another business team and you just heard about the acquisition that was being made. Well, the impact to you personally is very little. And I would argue the experience is very, very different when you're in the middle of the kitchen, if you will, making the soup versus watching the cook make the soup. So there's size, there's the agent of change, there's whether or not you desire it, there's a level of personal involvement, and there's your direct impact. I think all of those things play a role in terms of change when it comes down your street.
Okay, I like how you broke down the size of change relative to the overall organization, and then also relative to the, let's say the engineering team. You have a smallish engineering team that now just doubled in size. So it's a massive, or went up a
Absolutely.
third. That's a massive change, but not so much from the overall organizational side of things. From their the perspective at the top, it's not that big a deal, but to the people on the ground, it's a very big deal. So I like how you describe that.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of dig into that agency and that desire of change, because I find that really interesting. You had this line that you're saying that there's a fallacy from the perspective of the employees receiving that change, that leaders who deliver change agree and enjoy it, which may not always be the case. And so what that brought to mind is, I've been senior in an organization leading a change that I thought was good for the organization. And the owners of the organization and I disagreed on what that change should look like, but that change was going to happen. So I was the agent of the change in some senses, and I agreed that change should happen, but I didn't like the change that was actually happening.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of those things that, like, how do you break down, if you're implementing a change that you don't agree with, or following a change that you don't agree with, how do you wrestle with that as a leader?
Sure. And what you're describing, Brandon, I think there's, do I agree with the change, big picture? Am I for it? Am I in favor of it? And then there's the method and how the change is deployed. And there's a subtlety there.
Okay.
And I think it's important to really break down those subtleties and those differences, because how we might go about our approach, right? The methodology we might use to bring change into our business. I think that's the nature of diversity. We all have a different way and a different approach. To me, am I on board with the big change as being asked or being made? And that's something different. A rule of thumb I like to think about is, and just the nature of where I worked, change was happening constantly. One, we're technology, semiconductors. And if you know anything about Moore's Law, there's a great book called Chip Wars, for example. It talks about the fact that over time, you're going to get more and more transistors packed onto the size of ultimately chips. And of course, the cost is expected to decrease and the value exchange for the system is supposed to increase. Power, the amount of power that you can pack on each side of the chip, the amount of application, the amount of computing power, etc. It grows and grows and grows and grows over time, every 2-ish or so years. And so If you just think about the fact that we're releasing new products constantly, new factories constantly, factories that previously you ship products to can no longer be built there. So you got to offload there. Constantly changes, plus the organizational changes that were happening, a number of acquisitions, divestitures, things were happening all the time. So if you think about that, there needs to be some level of stability. And so the rule of thumb that I used to like to use from a leader's perspective is, man, if the change that I'm getting, let's just say 10 changes that come over the course of a year, that are at least medium in size. If I disagree fundamentally or philosophically with more than half of them, that's problematic. Really problematic, because one thing for sure as leaders is that we've got to carry the ball down the hill, if you will, and to the troops. And we've got to believe in what it is that we're asked to deliver. If that's happening too frequently, where we really don't believe in the mission, the vision, the philosophy of the organization, fundamentally, I believe fundamentally we need to find another place to go work. Maybe it's another business unit, maybe it's another company. But if you find yourself at odds that frequently, and I'll just say more than half the time, there's probably a good chance it's not the best fit. And the best thing for everybody is to just move on to a place that's going to be a better fit. That really wasn't the case for me. I was at one place for 22 years, had 9 different jobs, but of course, there were decisions that were very challenging. I'll give you an example of one that I agreed with philosophically, but the implementation was really, really difficult and painful. So here's an example. We had a situation where I had a group of employees, because of an acquisition at their other company, they were more senior in the organization. However, the company they worked at was much smaller than the company that they were going into. And so they previously had bigger titles, bigger salaries, etc., bigger job grades is what we call them. And we needed to sort of right size those elements inside of this larger organization. I understood why we were doing that. I understood why that made sense, because of course the people who were already in this larger organization, as they saw the folks coming in and saw their pay packages and their job grades, it didn't make sense. And so the painful part is that it's a one-time exercise. And how do you explain to someone who's previously been at some senior level, whether it's pay or whether it's job grade, that they're now being forced to reduce that? And then I'm the deliverer of that message. Not the funnest thing to do. And I think if you're the recipient of that bad news, you can often think they don't like me, they're trying to tell me I'm no good here. There's all these unintended consequences and really what I'll call false messages that could be interpreted if the communication isn't done really, really well. And even if the communication is done really well, there still can be some sore feelings after that. It was the right move to make. And I think every organization in the world would probably do something like this. But in that moment, it's painful. I agree, but I don't love to do it, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's a very clear example. If that were me delivering that news or receiving that news, I would not like that. Yeah, no.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But at the same time, I'm delivering that message, Brandon, and I can't go in with that employee who I'm now telling, sorry, your job grade is going to have to be reduced, and be like, yeah, I don't really agree with that either. Now it makes it look as if I'm putting my company, right, throwing the bus on them.
Yeah.
And that's certainly not a leadership attribute that we want to model. And so there is a rub there. And this is why I say it all the time. A lot of people want to be leaders until you actually start doing it. And leading it requires a different kind of ability to manage that duality internally while still believing and having conviction on doing what's right and doing it in a way that is respectful. People may not love it, but I'm not going to say, well, you suck because your job grade is reducing. No, you're a valuable employee. It's just that we've got to right size the organization. And right now it really, really hurts. And probably for the next year or two, maybe three, you might not see much in terms of pay increase, but just know relative to the company that you're now a part of, you were already at a really highly competitive place that now just needs to be right sized. And some people may say, I can't deal with that. I got to exit. But you know what? I'd rather have that candid conversation and give them that opportunity to go make a call. But at least they heard it directly, honestly, and straight, if you will.
Mhm. There's so much that could go into that about compensation and practice, best practices for doing different things, or the pay
Sure.
grades, like you said. I mean, you're trying to get the whole organization on the same, playing field and fairness and all
Mhm.
that. But I like what you said about how being a leader requires this other kind of ability, especially when you have that kind of cognitive dissonance of
Yes.
there's a change happening and I agree in principle, but not the execution of it. And you have those day to day, ethical quandaries, if you want to call them that, minor ones maybe,
Yeah.
a lot. And so I appreciate you saying that. I think as a leader, I want that kind of composure to feel like, this is the mission, I'm sticking to it.
Yep.
So I'm curious, maybe to help build some of that practice is, what are some ways that you think leaders could develop that ability to go through that kind of change if they agree with it, and they think it's a great idea, I've got to communicate this well, I've got to implement it well.
Yep.
But also if they disagree with it, how do they kind of handle that kind of situation? You mentioned that rule of thumb, but do you have any more practices like that
I
could be
do.
helpful?
Yeah, I do. One thing that's been really helpful for me, and this is a leadership principle beyond just the topic today of change, and that is really wrestling with the why. Simon Sinek has a great book, Start With Why. It's a good book to help us begin there. There's another really good book. It's not a business book, but it's called Purpose Driven Life, written by Rick Warren from a ministry perspective. And it's really talking about our individual purpose and why we exist. And I think getting to the why, so using that last example of the right sizing of job grade and pay, the right answer is we need to do this. And so internally, yes, I don't like it. I feel uncomfortable. This is painful. They didn't do anything wrong. And yet I've got to go deliver this message. However, if I stick with the principle of what's the right thing to do and why are we doing this? What's the real purpose behind it? What I also tried to do when I wrestled or when I struggled with the why behind something, I would go and seek another perspective. I might ask a peer. I might ask my boss. I might just, try to vet this thing out a few different ways in my mind so that I could get clarity about the situation. The one thing for certain, if you've got leaders on your team, which is most of the people that I led most of my life, many with advanced degrees, MBAs, technical degrees, engineers, what have you, they can pick up pretty quickly if you don't believe in the change that you're leading.
Mhm.
And there's got to be conviction behind it. And the only way conviction comes is if there's real understanding, a perspective that's gained beyond just my own brain, my own heart, talking with other people, colleagues, bosses, what have you. Maybe not about the specifics of my change, because that might be proprietary, confidential information, but I can talk with them about how they dealt with other situations in which they were conflicted, like I might feel at this moment. Having a mentor is really, really important. People who've seen dozens of these before you going into number one. I remember being a mentor to somebody, and it was the first time they were having to put together a bottom 10 list, and they were really, really struggling. And fortunately for me, or unfortunately, I don't know how you think about it, I had gone through that exercise many, many times. So the emotion of it is very different, having done it 10 years in a row versus that very first time as a new supervisor. And you've got to look at your list of people and be like, oh, bottom 10, right? So for me, I think it's understanding the why. Understanding the why, grasping that is really, really helpful in helping me be grounded as relates to what's the right thing to do. Why does this make sense? Because those questions could also come up in the course of that conversation as you're giving the news. People generally are going to want to ask why. And so you got to have the conviction to understand that. both hear as well as their perspective, where they sit and be prepared to answer those questions. That's what I found to be most helpful.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were describing that if you understand that why and you seek the, feedback or perspective of others, mentors or people that have gone before, it will help not only with the communication, like you mentioned, like you'll have ready answers for those objections, and your communication will be a lot clearer and sharper. But also for the why component, it feels like getting back to one of your fundamentals of what makes a great leader that we talked about in the first episode is you have more of that integrity.
Yep.
That you can now have this unified perspective that is whole, that you believe in, that you believe, the mission of the organization, what's going on. And so you become, in a sense, a better leader because you're able to kind of seek those perspectives out. If I'm tracking with what you're saying.
You are tracking. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, but yeah, the integrity is right who you are when you think no one is looking, as well as the state of being that says, when I'm with Brandon, I'm this way. When I'm with my family, I'm this way. When I'm with my team, I'm this way. When I'm with my boss, I'm the same way, right? There's consistency in actions, behaviors, and thoughts. There's alignment of those things. And it does make it easier when there's a real conviction and a perspective that's been gained that's broader than just my own thoughts. So yeah, I like the way you put that together. That's a nice little ad lib.
I'm listening very intently to these conversations because they're so helpful, because I am nowhere near your experience, your wisdom and leadership. So, okay. So yeah. So tell me a little bit more about, okay, let's say you're now a leader receiving some change that you disagree with. How do you navigate that? Because like you said, you've kind of gone through some things like that. But you're now receiving this. So let's say you're those employees that are receiving that kind of package, compensation package that you would disagree with or whatever. How would you think about going through that?
From the perspective of me, the leader, giving or receiving?
Receiving. So let's say, somebody above you is telling you to implement change and you're like, I just don't know about that. And you end up, maybe disagreeing with it. What do you, like fundamentally, like that's a problem. This is not like, I accept the mission, but this is like, no, this is actually a really big issue to me, and I want to get this resolved.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
I've got a really good example that came to mind just now. Hopefully I'll remember it as I'm talking. But let me say this. I didn't mention this earlier. There's a 3-word phrase that's critical. Any leader who's heard it before, or who's been in the situation has heard this before, which is, as leaders, we have 3 words: own the message.
Mm-hmm.
We must own the message, meaning it's a personal ownership. It's not, well, this is what the CEO told me. I learned this lesson really, really good when I was running financial planning and analysis for the company. I was taught very early on, because part of my role was to really get the entirety of the organization, the global finance organization, on the same page. So one of the things that would often occur is we get ready to release our next quarter's guidance in terms of revenue, profit, EPS, earnings per share. And sometimes the rack up of the businesses wasn't achieving what we believed we could actually go achieve in the marketplace. And so what I needed to do was go what we call collect goals, GOALS. And that meant that I needed to go and cut overhead. Maybe it's $30 million, maybe it's $20 million. That's not an insignificant number, but we have to go get that out of our system somehow. And I would go to all these different organizations, manufacturing. I go to this analog business and go to the embedded processing. And then I would go to our support organizations and say, hey, what can you give? Excuse me. Or I negotiate and say, last time you gave $2 million. Surely you could give $3 million this time. Or, you just released that big product. And so all your expenses for that should be done. You should be able to, the point is that this is change that people aren't looking for, and it's uncomfortable. And yet I'm the person that, asked to go make it happen. But I could not come to the people and say, the CFO told me to go ask you for money. It had to be, hey, this is what we as an organization need from you. Own the message. All right. So
I want to interject right there, if you don't mind.
go ahead.
This may be personal just to me, and I don't know, maybe if the other listeners would go this route, but I don't know if I would struggle with that.
Yeah.
And what it sounds like to me is almost it's like politicking.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
would be a terrible politician. I wear my emotions on my sleeve. I say exactly what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you? Is that a perspective that you're like, "Oh yeah, I've been through that. I felt that. Other leaders feel that." Or is that just me being me? I can't figure it out.
I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
I think when you're in that particular role, it's a different leadership role than the role I had after that.
Okay.
And so that particular role, you really are a captain or first lieutenant. Think about military structure, and the generals, if you will, are giving you the guidance that you now got to go disseminate to the entire organization. And you understand that. That's just a fundamental part of the job. And so by definition, you're going to be sort of barking orders. In some cases, maybe even half the time, they're coming from above.
Hmm.
And that's just part of the job. But again, I go back to the why. If I believed in my core that actually we could deliver 1 or 2 cents of EPS better than what the rack up of the organization was giving us, and I also knew we had some sandbaggers in the organization who
I like
almost
that.
always came under their overhead goals and almost always achieved higher revenue targets. Come on, you can do better than this. So there wasn't that political internal, and I hate, we'll talk about this at some point. I can't stand politics, and I can't stand the amount of energy they suck from an organization. But this was not politics. This was, no, you got money. You just holding it. So
Okay.
show your cards, man. Come on,
Yeah,
bring it.
Yeah.
And then there was others who legitimately, they put together a really, really tight forecast. And I knew that whatever they said they planned to do, they were going to come really close to it. Or if they didn't, it was going to be because of some really unforeseen circumstances. And I knew these businesses, right? And these leaders and how some gamed the system and some were very, very good in terms of being close to their actual versus their projection. Now, I want to get back to that question you asked me about what do you do when you are sort of the receiver of something you just fundamentally disagree with. Yeah, this happened frequently.
Yes.
So one of the privileges I had was to be on what was called the supply chain review board for the company. It later became called the order fulfillment review board. And this is where the heads of IT, if you will, IT operations, heads of manufacturing operations, and we as business operations people sat at the table, and we were the authority as it relates to recommendations and implementations of new systems and decisions. And there were frequently things that I disagreed with. For example, it might be, hey, we want to publish a lead time. I won't give a week, but let's just say we want to publish a lead time to our customer base that ensures them confidence of our ability to supply at a regular interval. And me knowing what our manufacturing cycle times were and our inventory availability was, there seemed to be a disconnect between this lead time we wanted to publish, which was often aggressive, versus what we could actually deliver from a raw manufacturing cycle time. That's just one example. Well, what did I do? I vehemently disagreed. And my approach for disagreeing, though, was more around trying to ask questions. Hey, what are we trying to accomplish? Have we looked at the difference between our manufacturing cycle time and our lead times? Hey, what businesses would we want to go apply this in? Our business, all businesses, analog businesses? That would typically be my approach, was to try to ask questions so that the logic ultimately rises up in the room. That wasn't always successful. Other times had to be a little bit more forceful. Sometimes it was tough to get a word in because there was so much commentary in the room. There was another instance where this is unrelated to operations. It was a people-related thing. And we were trying to put together success, forget what we called it, success factors or success metrics that we wanted people at a certain level of the organization to have. And one that we put on the list as a proposal by someone in the room was competitive, like internal competitive. We wanted our people to be internally competitive. And I thought, why on God's green earth will we put that as something we desire in our people? That by its very nature is going to make what is already a nasty internal environment even nastier. And I said, I'm fundamentally against that. I distinctly remember that conversation. So there are some changes that are worth absolutely putting your foot down for. There's others that in the grand scheme of things, is it unethical? Is it immoral? Is it illegal? Is it really going to make that big of a difference a year from now or 6 months from now? These are the kinds of questions we have to ask ourselves as leaders. There's others that are just too painful to digest. They just don't make any sense. And maybe they don't make sense because I'm ignorant. Maybe I need to go seek perspective. Or maybe they just don't make sense because they just don't make sense. There's this new phrase. They say, the mathin' wasn't mathin'.
Yeah,
right?
I've seen that.
And and sometimes that happens. And when it does, hey, there's got to be some clarity provided, or maybe this really doesn't make sense. So anyway, this is a little bit off the topic of change, but I'm answering that question that you raised earlier.
I think it's helpful because change is bidirectional, multi-directional. It's coming down from above. And then you deliver it. You're receiving it. You're an agent of change. You're the one that's promoting it. I mean, there's just different components of it, and I want to make sure that our listeners, as leaders in any degree of that chain of command, that they can navigate change well. And I think from what I've gathered from you is Socratic method maybe is really helpful. Yeah. Maybe you could say flat out, I disagree with this, and here's why.
Yes.
But maybe the Socratic method would be helpful in different scenarios where you want others to kind of come around to your view by just asking really pointed questions.
Yeah. Let me throw this one too, Brandon.
Yeah.
The last one I would say is it's Socratic, but it's slightly different.
Okay.
I learned this in coaching school. So when we ask why questions, and by the way, I think this would have been so helpful if I would have had this in the middle of some of these contentious conversations. When we ask the question why immediately psychologically in our brains puts most of us in a posture of defensiveness. When we ask what, that same level of defensiveness is not there. There's no need to put up the walls and the barriers, because what is, you're seeking the same answer, meaning I'm trying to understand or try to get clarity, or I'm needing an explanation on what's going on. But the what, for whatever reason, just makes a big difference in the stance internally that we have psychologically. So to the extent possible, one of the great questions to replace why is, hey, what do you mean by that? WDUM, right? What do you mean? And then you can say about that or by that, or in this case, or in this instance, what have you. But WDUM, what do you mean, goes further typically because it creates conversation. And I would almost argue it avoids dissonance, right? That emotional disconnection that Daniel Goleman talks about quite a bit. I think it's in his book, Primal Leadership. And it has an opportunity to build a bridge of understanding and resonance that goes much further and really furthering the conversation, which is what the end goal is, ideally in your favor. But the idea is not to create defensiveness, because when defensiveness happens, all of a sudden it's emotions talking, as opposed to the executive functioning in our brain, prefrontal cortex, that's operating. So I just realized I'm using a bunch of medical coaching terms and whatnot, and hopefully the listeners have not fallen asleep, but that's
no, the psychology of it, I think is so important. That's something I've learned from Charlie Munger, that he's always said, if you're, whatever you're doing in life, you got to know the psychology behind, your whether you're in sales, whether you're investing, knowing the mental models that you're working with, So anyway, so what you're describing, I think, is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I could sum up, and then I want to get maybe some final feedback from you. So sum up so far, for a leader leading change, managing and leading change, start with why. It's very important.
Yeah.
Own the message.
Yeah.
So that you can be, you can have integrity, you can communicate more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do disagree, use the Socratic method, specifically using what questions and not
Yes.
why questions.
Yes.
And if I might add as well, there are maybe almost concentric circles of what you agree with or disagree with, or how fundamental or how core something might be.
Exactly.
Understand what is core to you as a person, your beliefs, your
Yep.
vision. And then maybe there's something outside of that that you disagree with, but not as strongly.
That's
And then
right.
maybe outside of that, I can go either way on that, and kind of understand those levels of things so that when you receive some communication, maybe it'd be helpful to kind of analyze it that way.
I think you summed it up really, really well. There are some things in life, even that we argue over with our spouses. Does it really, really matter tomorrow? I
Yes, yes,
mean,
yes.
we look back on it and we're like, man, I cannot believe we were mad at each other and didn't talk for like 24 hours over something that really is not that important. And so for me, when it comes to a company, look, is this going to damage the mission of the organization? Is it in conflict with the mission of the organization or the vision, or even of our business unit and the goals we're trying to go achieve this year or in the next 2 or 3 years? And if it's not, can I live with it? Maybe I can live with it. Is it unethical? I can't live with that. Is it immoral? I can't live with that. Is it illegal? I cannot live with that. I like the concentric circles message or picture that you just mentioned as well. And, there was something maybe we could finish up with this that I haven't really touched on, Brandon, which is just my own approach. Part of it is the why, but then there's how you deal with change, because all of us are in different places. Some are, inventors. We welcome new tools, new systems, new ways of doing stuff. And others of us are the latest adopters, call it the laggards, if you will. And then there's most of us are somewhere in between. And so I've got a personal way that I've tried to kind of go about that. If that's helpful, I can share that.
Yeah, yeah, please do. That sounds great.
So first, I've never allowed myself to get too comfortable in any one place or space. And the reason that is because in my first 2 or 3 years as a professional, I went through a myriad of changes. I had 4 bosses in 2 years. From the time that I went from the higher end weekend interview where there were literally 60 of us on a bus, people from all over the country who were being interviewed to go get jobs. I think almost 30 out of those 60 people were offered jobs and ultimately accepted those jobs at the company. To having a team around me. There were 21 of us on this team, and then that team overnight dropped to 18 because there was a layoff. The internet bubble crashed 2001. I went from seeing record profit sharing payouts as big as the company had ever made because of record profits, new cars in the parking lot. It was incredible. To my personal 401k, because I was told, you're young, you're going to live a long time. Put your money in growth stocks. And man, my balance went from X to, very, very little, like that quick, to a hiring freeze, to the person in the desk right next to me. I'd been to his house. We were both new college grads, and he was let go and I got to stay, and I walked him out. All this happened in my first 2 years. I moved physically offices, 3 different places. I worked in 2 different buildings. Like, first 2 years of my career, I saw a significant amount of change. And so because of that, I've never allowed myself to get too comfortable and assume that things will always be the same. In fact, my mindset is a change is coming. So let me just assume that one is. That way, when it comes, I'm not completely thrown off. So that's number one, is never get too comfortable. That's not to say you're not comfortable here in my home. Of course, I'm relaxed, cool, everything's fine. But and in a work perspective, not allowing yourself to get too comfortable and assume that nothing will change. And in fact, do the opposite. Expect change, number one. Number two, a positive mindset. If I think about all the change that I've been through in my professional life, which we haven't even talked about, my personal life, I've never lived in any one place for more than 6 years. In fact, this house that I'm in now, cross our fingers, we might get to 7. I've lived in 5 different states. In college, I was a student athlete, and then I wasn't a student athlete. I had 50 different teammates. I've had 15 different suite mates and roommates of all different walks of life, including a brother-sister combination, a military guy who, yeah. Anyway, the point is that given all that change that I've personally endured, the truth is that really nothing has killed me. If anything, I've learned a lot from it. And a lot like the military school that I went to, the military officers would often make this phrase, which if you're military background, you've heard it. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I found that to definitely be the case in my life. And so I can approach a change whenever it's coming, whether I'm driving it or whether it's being pursued from someone else to me, if I'm the recipient of it. I can have a positive mindset because the truth is that I've not died. I'm still here. And although it's been difficult in some spots, there's a lot that I've been able to learn from it. So having a positive mindset, I think, is important. And then the third is control. Recognizing and accepting what I can and what I cannot control in any change situation has been critical. It's been paramount. The truth is that when my energy has been focused on what I can't control, I find myself in a high state of anxiety. Mm-hmm. When I focus my energy on what I can control, I feel much more stable and focused. And so imagine if we could just divest all the wasted energy when we're thinking about things that are completely outside of our control. For example, this year's election, oh my gosh, people are going to lose their minds before and after. Relax. Right now, everybody, take a deep breath. It's outside your control. Yes, you can vote, but it's very likely that your vote and my vote is not going to tip the scales. Vote, please vote. But at the end of the day, you can't control it. And how much impact is the next president or the current president staying in office going to have on my day-to-day life? Whether or not I'm able to raise my kids and whether or not I'm able to stay in this house and whether or not, et cetera, et cetera. So focusing on what I can control just reduces the stress, anxiety, and the wasted energy from stuff I have no control over. And I found that it helps me have a positive center of gravity as well, so that when those things that are happening all around me that I cannot control, they're going to do what they're going to do. But to the extent that I'm sort of in tune with what I can have some influence on and doing everything I can to keep that stuff stable, it reduces the chaos and the lack of stability that can come from focusing on everything else that is completely outside of my scope of influence. That's 3 ways that I've found that have been helpful in keeping me grounded as change comes or when I've got to give it.
All right. I want to sum up all of that in just one-liners, just steps people can take away.
Yeah.
Number 1.
Yeah.
Expect change.
Expect
Number
change.
2, be positive about it.
Sure.
Number 3, distinguish between what you can and can't control. And then when that change comes, number 4, start with the why. Why is this change happening? Number 6, maybe communicate clearly, which will help with that. Start with why.
Mm-hmm.
Number 7 would be, if you disagree with it, use the Socratic method.
Yeah.
And use questions like what and not why. And then finally, all of that, really own the message. Yeah. Own that change.
Yes. And whether you're the giver or the recipient, obviously if you're the recipient, there's a message coming to you, but then own it personally, because if you've got people that you got to go deliver that same message to, you got to own it. If you're an individual contributor and you're receiving it, take it as what it is. Is it changeable? If it's not, let it go and move on. Do the best you can with it. If it is something that's within your ability to change, then try to do something about that. Try to influence it. But yeah, owning that message is really, really critical. Love the way you summed that.
Tim, another masterclass in leadership. This one on change. Thank you so much. I cannot wait for the next episode.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll talk later.